Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
Hello, and welcome to PwC's Accounting Podcast. I'm Heather Horn, PwC US's Sustainability Technical Leader, and I'm so happy you decided to join us today for another episode of our video podcast series on sustainability reporting. And as regular listeners will know, this is the first time that we've actually done a video podcast. So if you're listening to the audio-only version and you'd like to follow along and actually see what's happening, you should head on over to the show notes for a link to find us on video. So for today's episode, we are turning our attention to one of the primary places in sustainability reporting, and that would be GHG emissions reporting, greenhouse gas emissions reporting. And we're going to try today to give an overview of all of GHG emissions reporting. So we'll see how that goes. And for this episode, I'm happy to welcome back Marcin Olewinski, who is a partner in our national office, also serves clients, also serves as the chair of our GHG working group covering the GHG protocol, ESRS, the ISSB standards, and pretty much any other that you can think of. And so Marcin, it's always such a pleasure to have you on, and thanks for joining me today.
Nice to be here.
All right, so Marcin, as I said, that we're going to try to cover the gamut of GHG emissions reporting today. We'll see how that goes. But you and I in the fall did a series, and we did bring on some other guests as well, but I think 7 or 8 episodes covering GHG reporting. Now we're going to try to squish that into one 45-minute one. So I thought what we could do is maybe give the highlights of overall what's involved from a reporting perspective, and then we'll dig in on one of the particular areas. But I know when we were writing the sustainability reporting guide, we were trying to bring some order and method to GHG reporting. And so we divided it into a 5-step process. So can you remind us of the steps? And then, as I said, we'll dig in.
Yes, thank you, Heather. So for all the listeners who listen to our podcast and read our SRG Chapter 7, it should be familiar process. So as you mentioned, we sort of identify and created this process to make it more understandable for everybody. So the 5 steps comprise of logical steps, how to think about reporting emissions from the beginning to an end. So the step number 1 is first understanding your reporting requirements. So is it voluntary reporting? Is it regulated reporting? Who is requiring, and what are the specific requirements of how the emissions needs to be reported? Once you determine that, then you have to determine organization boundary, which basically these steps, during these steps, you're trying to identify all the entities, activities, or operations that you're going to consolidate in order to determine what you need to report for emissions reporting. The third step is determination of operational boundary, which is basically identification of emission sources and classifying them into direct and indirect and between 3 scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Then once you have everything done, you have to measure emissions for every source, material source that you identify. And last but not least, you have to report them based on the requirements of framework that you identify as applicable to you in step 1 of the process.
All right. Sounds so easy, Marcia, when you talk about it. Obviously not so easy. But I thought for today, we've obviously talked a lot about all of these, but I know we've spent in particular a lot of time on various podcasts and webcasts talking about organizational boundaries and operational boundaries. So for purposes of today's episode, we're going to jump in straight into measurement. Maybe though, just as a quick reminder, you could tell us what we mean when we say scope 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll go into measurement. And I think one reason I really like this topic is measurement overall is basically the same among the standards, although there might be some differences in terms of how you report, but in terms of actually how you measure the emissions, there's only so many ways you can measure. So can you remind us scope 1, 2, 3?
Yes. So let's say you already identify the reporting requirements. You know what's within your organization boundary. You identified direct and indirect sources of emissions. Now you have to classify them between scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1 is all the direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by you. So everything that you have usually on your balance sheet, including your financial statements.
Well, everything in your organizational boundaries.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. That's probably the best term to use. But again, the key element is owned or controlled by you, and direct. Scope 2 are indirect emission sources. associated with or generated during the production of electricity, heat, and cooling purchased by your company. So again, those are indirect emissions. So they are generated outside of your organization boundary, but you use the electricity that during the generation, this electricity emissions are being generated. I say generated too much.
Too many times. Well, also, I think one thing about that we should just highlight here is that it's always referred to as purchased electricity. You did give the full definition, which includes heating and cooling, but again, sort of the shorthand there is purchased electricity. So something to keep in mind.
And we usually refer to this as a purchased electricity because this is by far the biggest emission source for Scope 2. That's what everybody knows. But I try to emphasize that every time so people don't forget
Exactly.
that it's not only electricity. And then it leaves us with Scope 3, which is all the other value chain emissions that are generated by sources that are not owned or controlled by you. So some sources that are owned or controlled by others. So we're talking about upstream and downstream emissions, for example, emissions generated during the production of goods and services that your company purchases and utilizes in their own, processes, or emissions generated by your consumers when they use the products that you sold them, right? So everything, again, indirect emissions outside of our organizational boundary, sources that are owned or controlled by others.
All right. So, and hopefully anyone listening to this podcast has already at least basic understanding of those. So let's again assume we've gone through those first steps. Now I'm up to measurement. What's the first step once I'm ready to start measuring my emissions?
So first of all, you identify the sources because all this emission.
Yes, I said that we were assuming that I had already done that.
Because measurement methodologies may be, or oftentimes are, specific to the source.
Fair point.
Source that you identify, and the emission source. So I'll start with maybe Scope 1 because we're talking about direct emissions by sources that we own and control. So it's more familiar. We control the data, so it's more familiar to our clients oftentimes. So generally, when we talked about emissions measurement methodologies, we distinguish two different kind of primary methods: direct measurement and indirect measurement methodologies. Direct measurements those are methodologies that measure emissions directly at source. They generally require instrumentations, measurement devices that you install it at source when emissions is being generated, and they measure directly the amount of emissions that this source is generating, right?
Hence direct measurement.
Exactly.
I'm sorry. Where do we normally see these? I'm sorry, I couldn't resist making that comment.
It is good. Well, those measurement methodologies are not extremely popular yet because of the technical difficulties or challenges that companies are facing. Usually we see them as a requirement by environmental agencies for some specific highly emitting sources where measurement at the source is possible. Like EPA in the United States, for example, requires for certain sources to have those kind of direct measurement techniques, right, to measure the emissions. Usually they require what is called continuous emissions monitoring systems, or SEMS, that, as I say, they installed directly at the emission source and measure it continuously as the source is emitting the GHG emissions.
Yeah, so you and I would have seen these when we're auditing power plants and industrial facilities, offices.
Refineries.
Yeah, refineries,
right? So
exactly.
You see this, right?
All right, so what would be probably much more meaningful to our audience, most of our audience then, would be, and even to be fair, companies that use direct probably use indirect for some of their emissions. So what about indirect techniques?
So generally, again, this is most popular measurement or calculation methodology right now because of practical issues with application of SEMS or existing of a reliable technology to do this. So most of our clients, for most of emission sources, you're going to use indirect measurement methodologies. Basically, this is the methodologies that rely on activity data, emissions factors, and global warming potential, right? So you, instead of capturing and measuring emissions, you're capturing and measuring activity data that results in emissions. So for example, when you take one of our Scope 1 emission sources is combustion, right? So in indirect measurement methodology, you're going to measure or capture in any other way activity data, which is in our case fuels used or fuel that is being combusted. And then you have a quantity of that fuel. Then you're going to apply emission factors to this combusted fuel and potentially global warming potential, depending on how the emission factor is being structured. So that's why it is indirect, because you don't measure emissions, you measure activity or capture activity data. And it depends on the emission source, what the activity data will be and what type of emissions factors you're going to use.
Yeah, and actually one of the things I like best, I shouldn't say that's an overstretch. One of the things I like in Chapter 7 is that we do have this equation written out in terms of the activity data, emission factors, and global warming potentials. And I do think it's helpful to sort of think of those three components. But as then I'm thinking, Martian, how to, I will say, apply that formula, where do companies go look for guidance on that? Because obviously there's lots of different emissions factors, lots of global warming potentials. You mentioned different sources of activity data. So what do I do with that information?
Well, so it all depends on, oftentimes I would start with what is your reporting requirement, because depending on that, you're going to go to different places as to how to capture this activity data and where to look for emission factors, or even how to calculate, because this is what we provided in our Chapter 7. This is generic formulas. I want to make sure that everybody understands, depending on the purpose of the reporting or regulatory agencies, this formula might be a little bit more complex, right? So first I say, look at what is your reporting requirement. Again, we are in the United States, so I'm going to defer to EPA that regulates certain industries in the United States. They're going to prescribe specifically what calculation formulas you should use, how to capture the activity data, what this activity data should be, and where to go for emission factors, right? Let's say if you report voluntarily based on GHG protocol also has a guidance or various calculation tools. They're going to provide you the formulas or sources of emission factors that is very useful as you are preparing your emissions data, right? So it all depends on who is regulating you, what's the purpose of your reporting, what emission sources do you have? Because again, as an example, I gave combustion. That's fairly simple, whether this is stationary or mobile combustion, right? This is a fairly simple and common source. Once you start going to emission sources like, industrial processing, right? Or vented or fugitive emissions, those calculation formulas might have way more input. So your activity data might not be just, let's say, volume of fuel combusted, but might be more complex. Emission factors might also not be only the standardized emission factors provided by publishing authorities, different governments, or other kind of bodies who do this. It might require more calculations to determine what this emission factor is. In our Chapter 7, we define that as a tailored emission factors, but again, it's a term that we coined, but is designed to encompass various calculation techniques that might be required by different regulatory bodies or reporting frameworks.
Well, and I think, Martin, key point here for most of our listeners, I would assume, is that, the EPA or even the GHG protocol is helpful, but really they are thinking about reporting under ESRS or the ISSB standards. And for entities reporting under those standards, then there actually are requirements for what you should be using for emission factors as well as the global warming potentials. So even in those cases, there are specifications and companies should make sure that they're following those. So I think this is a key point.
Exactly. I would agree. That's why I study. You have to understand that the first point, you have to understand what are the reporting requirements you're subject to.
Yes. So. That's why I'm always happy when you agree with me too. So.
I always agree with that.
All right. So then, Martin, that was scope 1. And again, that was quite a quick trip through scope 1, a lot more to it if you're actually measuring. But then let's talk a bit about scope 2, because there's definitely some subtleties when you're dealing with this indirect purchased electricity, heat, et cetera.
Yes. So on a high level, on simple note, the formula to calculate scope 2 emissions is pretty much the same as for scope 1. You need activity data, you need emission factor, you need global warming potential. What's easier for scope 2 is activity data is generally limited to purchase electricity, right? Or purchase heat or cooling, right? In scope 1, it can depend on emission source, but in scope 2, they are sort of prescribed, right? And vast majority of lion's share of scope 2 is purchased electricity. So, and you can get this data, activity data directly from utility invoices, right? They usually provide you consumption data, and most of our clients use those to.
Yeah, you could have meters too, I guess,
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Where it becomes really, so by definition, right, just want to make sure the scope 2 is indirect.
It has
to be indirect, right? Because it's indirect source. You cannot, measure emissions directly because they're not generated by you, but your power provider or utility provider or heating and cooling provider, right? So what's unique about scope 2 is emission factors. I mean, wouldn't say unique, but what's special about scope 2 is the source of emission factors and a type of calculation methodologies attached to those emission factors, right?
So, Martin, let me cut in because I actually had jotted down a note while you were just speaking that when we were talking about scope 1, we jumped straight into the formula and started using terminology, emission factors and global warming potentials without really explaining. And I think many of our listeners will know, but just to make sure, before you get into the details for scope 2, when we talk about emission factors, what are we actually referring to? And then I'll ask the same for global warming potential.
Well, so emission factors is basically standardized factor that reflects the emission generating potential of activity of one unit of activity, right? So as I mentioned, let's stick to the combustion, right? Combustion of fuels. Emission factors represent the number of emissions generated by combustion of one, let's say, gallon of gasoline, or 1 cubic meter of combustion of 1 cubic meter of natural gas, for that matter. So there's basically standardized representation of this, emitting ability or of a fuel or source, right, or activity that is coming from emission source. So that's emission. Again, is designed for standardization. As you can imagine, there is a presumption, actually it's supported by science, right, that similar fuel sources, they generate the same number of emissions irrespectively when you combust them. And the same applies to different emission sources. So in order to make the process of emissions reporting easier for companies, we have various databases or regulatory bodies who publish those emissions factors, which are calculated based on given countries kind of a total emissions, or they might be calculated based on specific fuel sampling measured, by those who publish those factors. And again, it's having the emission factors allows companies to avoid need to going and doing this themselves,
Yes.
right? As long as they fit within the standardized activity type or emission source that the publishing body includes in their published emission factors.
All right. And then how about global warming potential?
Oh my goodness, I hate that one, right?
Oh, I was thinking I like this one. I can picture the chart in our...
all right, here you go. You go for that.
Well, okay. I'll do very simplistically and then you can be more scientifically. So when I think about this, basically, global warming potential, you start with CO2, and that has a global warming potential of 1. So 1 unit of CO2, you say 1. But then when you start to get into different types of gases, they have much bigger global warming potential. So even that's like methane is actually much, much higher than CO2. So even though the absolute amount may be much smaller, the impact on the environment and global warming is actually much higher. And so what I really like about this is if you look in our guide, or you can look many places, there's actually a chart that says CO2 1, and then it goes down by type of gas until you get to these huge numbers for some of the certain types of gases. But please.
Yeah, so for me, it's like that's why I said it's kind of a very scientific language, but I try to simplify everything.
Yeah.
So for me, it's an essentially conversion factor to bring different gases. And remember, we didn't cover it today, but we covered it in different episodes. There are 7 gases that are considered to be main GHG gases. And this is the conversion factor to bring emissions calculated for each of the gas to the same measurement unit, which is CO2 E. As you said, CO2 as the biggest kind of the gas with biggest impact on global warming, because this most common gas that is in atmosphere has a global warming potential of 1, but other gases have a much bigger potential to contribute to global warming. As you mentioned, methane is like, I think 27, right? Or 26 or 27 times than CO2. So in order to equal everything and convert it to the same measurement unit, CO2E, you were using these global warming potentials.
All right, I think that's enough science. And if there's any scientists listening, we apologize.
Yes.
So,
well, I'm going to refer everybody to SRG 7 when we have a very good definition.
Yes, we do have good explanation. Okay, so sorry, I actually cut in. So just to like re-level set for our listeners, we were actually talking about, so that the definitions of emissions factors and global warming potentials apply across the scopes. But you were starting to get into some of the detail of why it's a bit different when we think about this for scope 2 in particular. So now that we've given the background, go ahead.
Okay.
Now that you can remember where we were.
Yes. So scope 2 measurement method. So but basically we have two different methods to measure scope 2 emissions, which one is called location-based and the other is called market-based method. The reason for having two different methods, right, is because of inherent nature of electricity, right? So when you think about this, electricity can be generated from fossil fuel or nuclear or renewable sources. And all of these kind of generated sources have a different emissions profile, right? So as you can imagine, renewable sources generally do not generate scope 1 or generate emissions during the production of electricity, while fossil fuel like coal or natural gas generate quite a bit of emissions, right? So, however, the purchasing, remember, scope 2 is a indirect, right, emission source related to purchase of electricity. You, as a purchaser of electricity, it's really difficult to say from what source the electricity is coming because we all buy this from the same grid. And when electricity is supplied to the grid, it's like electrons are fungible. So you don't really know what you're buying. You're buying from the same grid. Everything is mixed. So historically, there's only one method, which is called location-based, which basically you use the average grid emission factors to calculate your scope 2 emissions. And the reason for that being because you buy from a grid. And this grid is a mixture of multiple, sources or renewable sources, fossil fuel sources, nuclear. So what you're buying, when you're buying from a grid, you're buying the mixture of those different sources which have a different emissions associated with them.
Yeah, so from a practical view, you really have no idea which electricity you're actually using, unless in some rare cases you might have
direct connection to the power plant.
Yeah,
but as you mentioned, it might be on some big industrial factories which have a
small, a cogeneration
exactly, which they have a power plants, across the fence. But generally, a vast majority of reporting entities, they're buying emissions from the grid. Hence, location-based reflects the average emission factors of the grid. So if you as a company today wanted to make some conscious choices as to where to buy electricity, you wanted to buy electricity primarily from renewable sources, right? Unfortunately, location-based method would not allow you to reflect that, right? Because it doesn't.
Unless it reflects the grid you're in, though,
yes.
Right? So
yes, but so you're right. I mean, you can always choose to build your factory in a less kind of emission intense grid, but for most of our clients, the factor is already there, and they have no really impact on the emission or grid intensity, right? So location-based method does not really allow companies to fully reflect choices that they're making to limit their emissions associated with purchased electricity. However, therefore, for quite some time, GHG protocol would only indicate one or allow for one calculation method. I think back in 2015, they introduced the other, which is called market-based method. And just to clear up front, GHG protocol requires reporting entities to report emissions using both methods. So like you have to calculate and report both scope 2 emissions using both methods. But in short words, market-based method basically allows companies to reflect or take into account the choices they make as it relates to the source of the purchased electricity. So basically, as opposed to use the emission factors which are specific to the contractual arrangements that you have to purchase electricity. Again, you still get the same electricity from the grid. However, that method allows you to, if you, let's say, sign a purchase power agreement with renewable generator, it allows you to reflect the emission factor associated with this specific generation. It also allows you to consider other instruments like renewable energy credits if you don't buy have a PPA, you can also buy the credit by itself and reflect it in your calculations.
Yes, I have some theoretical issues with this particular calculation, but I do understand why that we have it in place. So, and this is not the episode for it. In fact, I think we have a much more detailed episode where we talked quite a lot about this, if you're interested. All of that said, you mentioned GHG protocol requires you to report both market-based and location-based. So does ESRS. But how about ISSB?
So ISSB requires a calculation and reporting scope 2 emissions using location-based. However, so it doesn't require market-based, but it requires disclosure of information about contractual instruments that company acquired. So PPAs, regs, or other, this type of instrument. So again, it's slightly different. You don't have to have a tool calculation, but you still have to provide the information to allow user understand those choices that you're making. The one thing I want to make, because recently we've seen one question, the fact that you have to report emissions using both methodology, it means that you have two numbers to report. You should not be adding them. I'm being facetious, but
that's a good reminder. That would give you a much bigger number. If you had to
so
add.
those are the same emissions that are measured differently. So I think most of our viewers would not come up with the idea to add them up, but just to clarify.
Although you do have to add up scope 1, 2, and 3 to get to your total. And so I do think it can get a bit confusing.
That's why I wanted to emphasize that those are, again, the key point, those are the same emissions or associated with the same activity. They're just calculated differently. So that's why you would never add the two numbers together.
So Marcin, we did, I think, 2 full episodes talking about scope 1 and scope 2, but something actually, Carl, you and I were on together today. One of the things that came up as a place where we are also getting a lot of questions is the quality criteria, or what types of contractual instruments are sort of allowed to be included in these calculations. So can you talk about maybe those criteria at a very high level? And then I think we have some best practices that we see that companies should be considering in using these instruments and then reporting.
Yes. So when you look at the scope 2 calculation guidance issued by GHG protocol, it outlines specifically what type of instruments you could be using in the calculations and specific quality criteria that you have to meet in order to be able to use it, right? And let me maybe back up why, right? So the main worry of GHG protocol, which I agree with this,
I definitely agree with,
is double counting. So when you think about electricity market, right? Obviously, as we said, you're buying electricity from the grid. It is what it is. But then how and who reflects contractual arrangements can differ, because you can have a very easy, very often what could happen, you buy the electricity from a grid based on the purchase power arrangements that has, renewable attributes attached to this. Currently, there is a market that allows to detaching those attributes and selling them separately. So you could end up in a situation where a company that buys the actual electricity reports it as a renewable electricity in the calculation, and then whoever bought the separate detached, renewable attributes could also claim this. So the main kind of a goal of GHG protocol was to provide certain level of criteria to ensure that these claims are valid and there's no double counting, that two parties do not claim the same attribute and say that they use them to demonstrate they reduced emissions in the market-based calculations, right? So when we talk specifically about, just to kind of demystify those instruments, right? So first we're talking about energy attribute certificates, right? In US, most often we see renewable energy certificates. So those are specific certificates that certify that energy or power, electricity was generated from renewable sources, wind, solar, and similar. Then you have your normal contracts to purchase electricity like PPAs, which may or may not have embedded renewable attributes in them, right? Then you might the next kind of a type of this contractual instruments are supplier-specific emission factors. So you can get those specific factors from your suppliers, and they calculate using the specific generational mix of that suppliers. Then you go to residual mix. So, emission factors in the grids after consideration of use of renewable attributes.
And I'm just laughing because I think for most of our listeners, we probably already lost them, a few points ago. But I mean, actually, this is critically important because these residual mix factors actually do address the issue we both have with this, which is this double counting. So again, this is probably a lot of detail, but it is a very important point. We don't have these factors in the US, though.
Yes, we don't. So, but in Europe, there's quite a few markets when you can obtain those factors. In US, because we don't have residual mix factors, a lot of people, when they calculate the remainder of non-renewable, they use location-based factors, which is also allowed, but by protocol, but it is lower priority on their hierarchy list, right? And then, so those are type of instruments. Then, as we mentioned, they all have to meet specific criteria. And then all these criteria are designed to ensure that there's a credibility to that market and to this calculation. So first of all, those instruments has to really convey the renewable rights to you, right? There has to be a mechanism to track them and retire them, right? You have to have a timely retirement. You have to have a process of identifying that they are generated in a market which is as close as possible to where you consume the energy. Because imagine you can theoretically be consuming power, electricity in the state of Texas and buying renewable or EACs from China, right?
Yes, although to be fair, Texas has a lot of renewables, so maybe our example should have been
but like if you already there or above, like that's why you have a quality criteria. So you're trying to bring this, and again, when you think about it, it's logical. You want to have this actual generation as close as possible to where you consume. So when you're buying energy from the grid, you at least partially you're buying this renewable energy that you have certificates for, right? So I think, and the timing, right? You wanna make sure that a timing of generation of renewable energy is as close as possible to when you actually consume it as a user of this electricity. So again, as an example, you're not buying and claiming renewable energy certificates from like 10 years ago, right? Somebody has it somewhere hanging in a closet, and then like, whoop, here you go. So it's all about creating credibility. As you mentioned, there's a lot of pros and cons having the market-based methodology. It has specifically to do with the nature of energy. There's a lot of opponents. They're thinking that really it doesn't represent reality. So GHG protocol designed those criteria to minimize this criticism and ensure as much credibility as possible.
Yeah, and I think disclosure obviously is important everywhere, but particularly here. A couple maybe wrap-up points on that before we move on is, first of all, you mentioned that these are the GHG protocol quality criteria from the Scope 2 guidance. That actually is also, those specific quality criteria are also in ESRS where they reference using that, so definitely consideration. And then that doesn't matter for companies reporting in accordance with IFRS S2 because they have this other reporting, but they also have some very specific disclosure requirements about quality of their contractual instruments.
Yes.
Okay,
I would agree.
You still agree. Excellent.
Yes.
All right. So definitely more, and I think this topic you and I both are very passionate about, so we could definitely go further. But why don't we move on then to Scope 3? And Scope 3 is very complicated and then probably, again, could be a few episodes of its own. But do you want to give a, sort of high level what we should be thinking about, particularly when we start thinking about these Scope 3 categories?
So, as I mentioned before, right, Scope 3 is indirect emissions occurring in sources which are owned and controlled by other companies. So basically, emissions in your value chain, upstream and downstream. So, and we have Scope 3 standard outlines 15 categories of those emissions. As an example, Category 1 is emissions generated during the production of goods and services that you purchase. Category 11 is emission generated by products that you sold to your customers when they use those products, right? Then you have emissions associated with transportations of goods and services to your doors, the business travel, waste of the products that you sell. So there's 15 categories. And then why it's important? Because they are designed to capture first of all, the emission sources that are, allows you to identify emission sources that are most impactful to you, and they grouped within logical kind of groupings. And second, it also impacts how you're going to be measured, how you're going to be collecting the data, how you're going to measure those emissions. So these 15 categories are very important. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them. SRG 7 has them listed. And which is what is important, the regulatory framework, like ESRS and IFRS S2, they all defer to Scope 3 standard for identification and definition of these 15 categories. So all these standards require reporting Scope 3 emissions grouped within these 15 categories. But again, why it's important, depending on a category, your measurement methodology will be different. Your data, activity data that you need to gather is going to be different. And challenges with gathering this data is going to be different. Like for me, again, Scope 3 measurement, what's unique and challenging, by definitions, you using the data that oftentimes you do not control, right? Like Scope 1, you control the data that is needed to calculate emissions. Scope 2, to some extent, because you do have those utility invoice. Scope 3, it's not always the case, right? So underlying primary data is usually, controlled by the value chain partners, but there are some different measurement methodologies that allow you to find a workable solution, put it that way. Because we oftentimes hear a criticism of Scope 3, which I'm not saying it's not valid, that it's very difficult to gather all the inputs and data to calculate from the value chain partners, which is true. It's a factual, but Scope 3 standard provides, and the calculation guidance, they provide different kind of a methodologies to measure, whereby you might not necessarily have to gather all this information directly from your value chain partners. You can use the data that you might be within your control as well. Again, so it might be less precise, but there are various methodologies that you can use.
Yeah, and I think this is where when the basic equation is the same for calculations, so the activity data, emission factors, and the global warming potentials, but the actual formulas that are used for Scope 3, I mean, we have a whole lists of them in our guide. Now, Marcin, you mentioned these categories, and I think one of the things that's difficult for people who are relatively new to this is people often just use the category names instead of saying what they relate to. So I highly recommend that people learn those. But you also mentioned the fact that you're using different measurement techniques depending on the category. But no matter what technique you're using or which category, I think one of the other things people struggle with is, when we talk about the value chain, you have your first ring, you have your second ring, and it kind of goes on and on and on. And then when you think about emissions, there's so many different potential sources of emissions that it's like mind-boggling in some ways what you might need to measure. And so in order to address that, the Scope 3 standard includes this idea of minimum boundaries, which basically lets you also put a fence around all of this expanding web of value chain emissions. So I know there's a lot of issues with minimum boundaries. We're going to go into those in more detail in next week's episode. So it's a, preview. But can you at least explain the concept of minimum boundaries? So, again, to kind of complete this conversation today.
We're a really good team, because I was supposed to start with this and you simply forgot.
It's okay. I don't mind.
Good catch. So as you mentioned, that's, the Scope 3 standard outlines specifically 15 categories. And as part of a definition of each category, it specifically prescribes what type of activities should be included and how far you should go within your value chain. As an example, for category 1, which is emissions generated during the production of goods and services that you're purchasing and using within your organizational boundary, are what is called cradle-to-gate emissions. So all the emissions generated from the extraction of minerals that are needed to produce the goods or service, all the way through the production of the goods and service and transportation to your gate. So you're capturing value chain emissions. That's why it's called, from cradle to gate, right? So everything upstream of your company, right? And the same applies to all the capital goods that you're reflecting in category 2. But then you have other categories which this boundary is much smaller. For example, transportation, right? Category 4, if I'm not mistaken. This is emissions associated with upstream transportation. So when you're using transportation service that provides goods and services all the way to your door, You have to calculate the emissions generated during the provision of the service. So when you have if you use let's say a truck that combusts gasoline, you're gonna report the emissions generated during combustion of this gasoline when this truck is providing the transporting goods to your gate, right? So you don't go all the way to the production of this fuel within this category. You only focus on those kind of scope 1 and 2 emissions associated with the transportation service.
Yeah, but even that margin is interesting, and I think a good lead into our next topic. Well, so first of all, just as a reminder, as I said, there's a lot more to minimum boundaries. We'll talk about that next week. But I love your example of the truck, because let's say that truck is carrying materials for you and materials for someone else. Well, then, not all of the emissions from that truck should accrue to you. But I think this is where it can start to get very complicated very quickly with scope 3 emissions calculations. So without giving a complete lesson in scope 3, because I think the scope 3 standard and the scope 3 measurement guidance, probably in total 300 or so pages, maybe a little less. What are some of the highlights that you would give in terms of what people should be thinking about?
Well, so first of all, you have to understand all the activities within each category and which are relevant to you. So in a Scope 3 standard and also ESRS and IFRS S2, they provide guidance how to think about what's relevant to you, which emission sources you should be reporting. But the key is to understand for each category, what are those emission sources, because that will drive what type of activity data you need to calculate those emissions. Right. And it also determine, again, what is the minimum boundaries. So do you have to, the car example is pretty good. Let me expand on it a little bit more. As I said, you just reporting scope 1, 2 emissions generated during the service itself. Optionally, you could also report emission, be required to report emissions generated during production of the car that is delivering service.
This is where minimum boundaries
That's
are
what I'm
so
saying.
important.
That's important to understand, to know what exactly you should capture. You don't have to category 4. You're actually not required to go and figure out what are the emissions associated with production of the car. You're just focusing on the service itself. So that's a starting point. Then obviously the key would be data. What data you should be gathering for each category in order to measure emissions. And this is what leads you to different measurement techniques and methodologies. So Scope 3 standard and calculation guidance, they provide various methodologies, and they differ depending on a category of how to calculate emissions. We, in our SRG7, we focus on 3 that are most kind of a common used, but I just want to make sure those are not the 3 and only, right? I mean, each category you have to study really carefully, because you might have a different reiterations of the methodology, different twist to how you apply that, or different methodology itself. But when you look at the 3 most prevalent that we outlined, first is supply a specific method. So this is the method when you actually obtain the emission information from your value chain partners directly, right? So that's the most challenging probably, because if you imagine large organization and you have, let's say, 2,000 suppliers, for example, or an additional 2,000 of other value chain, let's say downstream value chain partners, gathering all the emission factors from those suppliers might be challenging, right? At least currently, the market, the development of a market, let's call it emission factor market, is not it's not as well developed. Not everybody produces it. So, but we have a lot of clients who, at least for the largest suppliers, let's say, or largest value chain partners, they actually have a process to obtain those factors specific, and they basically represent the actual emissions generated in association with goods or service you purchase from those suppliers, right? Then you have the average data method, which is quite popular because you use the activity data, which specifically represents emission generating activity. So let's say number of goods that you purchased from your suppliers, right? So that's going to be your specific activity data that you need to use. But then instead of getting emission factors directly from your suppliers, you're going to use some market averages. And there's a lot of providers of those emission factors. Again, let's say you're buying cars or you're buying steel, right? There are databases that you can use and find the emission factors, average emission factors to produce, steel and deliver it to the gate of a purchaser in certain markets, right? So again, those are not emission factors specific to the, piece of steel that you're buying, but it represents more market averages. Again, it's not as precise as supplier specific, but it at least usually reflects the actual activity associated number of goods that you're purchasing and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I think, Martin, that's where if you're buying steel, maybe this could work a little bit better than if you're buying some more custom or unique type of product. That's where it can get much more complicated. Mm-hmm. But again, I think one of the things that's important here for companies is that the more precise you can be, particularly if you have goals related to emissions reductions, mm-hmm. then the easier it is going to be mm-hmm. to measure those. But I know there's still a few more methods that we have to go through.
I want to the hybrid is a combination of two, and we see it quite often too when companies use part of their emissions are calculated using supplier specific and the other part is average method, right? But then, and the last I want to highlight is a spend-based method where it's sort of probably least precise mm-hmm. when you calculate emissions based on a dollar spend that you have. So you do not have information about quantity of goods and services that you purchased or any other quantity of activity that you have. Instead, you use dollar values that you spend. Again, least precise, but oftentimes a lot of our clients, their system not designed to mm-hmm. capture volumetric data, especially when you talk about multiple emission sources within your value chain. For some of them you may, for the others you don't. So there is the spend-based method allows to use a common denominator, which is currency spent on purchase of goods, which all our clients have that data because it resides in their general ledgers. They use it for financial reporting. And there's emission factors that basically calculate average sector or market emission factors based on the spend. There's multiple organizations who calculate that, use annual studies or periodic studies to update that. Those emission factors are calculated based on industries within the geographical regions, countries, you name it. And again, least precise, but at least in this case, you cannot argue you don't have a data, right? Because everybody has this data, right? And there's a lot of criticism, but that's not very precise. Well,
and I think this goes back to the point I was actually just making about precision. And I smiled when you talked about volumetric data because I was actually presenting to a client with one of our advisory partners maybe like a month mm-hmm. ago. And he told this anecdote that I just thought was great, which was talking about a company that was putting in a new ERP. So it was mm-hmm. nothing to do with sustainability reporting. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they were preparing for ESRS and they didn't have, in this case was actually they didn't have a good way of tracking their electricity data. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to scope 2, but nonetheless good here. They figured out somehow between these two products that they could add one field to the ERP, mm-hmm. have that data input at the same time, and then they would capture all the volumetric data that they needed through a systematic approach. And that's, again, it's just interesting. One field could sort of transform reporting mm-hmm. in that area. So I just think it's interesting that there is, you can move from this dollar data, mm-hmm. spend data to activity data in mm-hmm. some cases. So,
which is that not only that applies also to scope 1 and scope 2. We have a lot of clients that might be gathering the invoices for purchase electricity, but do not capture the actual electricity consumption.
Right, that's what they were adding to this in this case.
You see, usually with emissions intense industries, a lot of times the clients are tracking very carefully the quantity of fuel being combusted or megawatts of electricity being utilized because oftentimes they use it to calculate their performance indicators, and that's how they track efficiency of their business. But when you have this entities operating with less intense, where maybe that's not your primary operational efficiency indicator, you might not be tracking mm-hmm. this data in the system. And I see it all the time that clients, complain about the grueling nature of having to sit down at the end of the year and call the utility providers, go to websites, try to find
all this data.
Again, it exists, but you have to start collecting it. And as you said, we see more and more clients, even within the scope 1 and 2 worlds, put it that way, they start to kind of thinking about this, well, it's only one field. I have this data, I just didn't capture it in a system that would allow me later more effectively and efficiently to use it in emissions calculator. So that applies to all emission sources, and we see that slowly as a trend because everybody realized it's easier to do it up front because you can benefit from this on an ongoing basis as opposed to having this bolt-on process at the end of the year trying to manually capture this data, right? So, and there's other benefits from having this data too. As we said, like, even our firm can benefit from analyzing our energy efficiency because that translates into dollars, right?
Yes. Well, this room we're in is freezing. So maybe we could save some electricity by having less air conditioning. So Martian, we have literally only skimmed the surface of measurement, and clearly, particularly with scope 3, there's a lot more we could talk about. However, we have been talking for 50 minutes. So I think our audience has probably had close to enough. And obviously we have other episodes and we can continue along on this as well. But I do want to kind of pull things together and bring it to a close by maybe, we were just talking about some recommendations, but I know one of the things we talk about is data quality. If you want to give some recommendations there, or just more broadly, I know you have a lot of experience working with clients in measurement. What are some of the final words of wisdom?
I'm always advising my clients, first of all, document your policies as it relates to measurement methodologies to start with, right? So you want to make sure that it's very clearly and clear and prescriptive, so everybody across your organization know what these methodologies are, because that drives how you collect the data. And if you're subject to regulatory requirements, almost every framework requires you to disclose your measurement methodology. So you're already kind of taking care of that up front. Second, document your process, right? Especially as we expanding and report more and more, like companies start with scope 1 and 2. Now everybody has to, if they're subject to this regulatory reporting requirements, they have to start reporting scope 3. Document your process as to where the data comes from, make conscious decisions. You don't have to have it like fully perfect and get supplier specific data for everything, right? Use the methodologies available to you, focus on, maybe larger sources, but the starting point is decide where what data you're going to be using and document your process, because that's going to go a long way, right? And again, don't believe the hype that everything has to be 100% perfect based on the data from your supplier, measured right almost with a scope. And that's not the world of emissions, right? Everybody, including regulators, understands that we are in the process of development. We are growing, and a lot of good clients that I have, they have a good processes. They see it as a continuum, right? They see it's like we trying to improve every year. Quality of our data, accuracy of our calculation methodologies. You can't get everything at the same time. You can make it kind of a multi-year process and have this approach of continuum of improving quality of the data. And over time, especially as we see these regulatory requirements, more and more your value chain partners are going to be producing this data. So it is going to be much bigger availability of the data on the market. So again, to me, it's playing it smart up front. Don't shooting for the what's the word for the moon?
Yes,
not shooting
that's right.
for the moon. Think about this as a multi-year journey and a process. But whatever you do, make sure it's properly documented. That's auditor speaking in me. So
yes, although I was interested to hear you say that, it doesn't have to be completely precise, but I think even when you're talking about that, you still have to have a good method. You still have to have an approach you're using. It's just that your approach may not be going all the way back to the source data.
Exactly. Because again, all the measurement approaches have embedded certain level of precision in them. Some are more precise. The others are less precise. And that's what I'm talking about. If you select certain measurement methodology, you have to be collecting this data precisely and accurately, right? What I was referring to is the measurement methodologies, because they are on the spectrum, right?
Yes. Well, and I think that maybe the thing I would pair with it is disclosure, because it's very important for then the users of your information to understand what sources you're using, what techniques you're using, and otherwise.
Where your data is coming from. Is it primary? Is it secondary? So it's all very important. Having really clear and very transparent disclosure. I think in our world, it's it's majority of your success, right?
Yes. So, well, anyway, obviously, even for a wrap up, we could keep going, but I'm going to stop us here. But Marcin, as always, such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather.
And to our listeners, thank you as well for joining us today. We appreciate you being on and enjoying this conversation, hopefully. I did give a preview earlier, but next week we will be talking again about emissions, digging into some of the really more difficult issues that we dealt with in this first year of reporting for ESRS and, some of the things that came up. So hopefully that will be helpful to you no matter where you are in your reporting journey. And then in addition, this entire series, we've covered all different types of topics, including an overview of all the different standards. We have an episode talking about the omnibus regulation and what may be coming from that and others. So highly encourage you as well to check those out. And if you want to make sure you get all of our information, you can subscribe to our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. And so I hope you follow us and subscribe. So thanks again for joining us today.
That's our show for today. Tune in next week for more fresh episodes. So that you never miss any of our audio content, follow the PwC Accounting Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And to stay up to date on all our latest accounting and reporting news, sign up for our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. From Thought Leadership at PwC, I'm Heather Horn. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates, and they sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors, including accountants and lawyers.